Welcome to Raw Machines, a journey into some of the most remarkable working processes still found around the world. In this episode, we return to Hunsrück, an agricultural region within the cultural landscape of the Rhineland, where traditional clay-based crafts are still practiced in their most direct and original form. Here, shaped by clay itself, a lasting relationship between people and natural material has been forged and passed down through generations. Let's begin. Alongside timber, clay ranks among the most essential building materials in rural dwellings of the Hunsrück region. This material was extracted through open-pit quarrying from clay pits, typically with faces rising to about 3 meters, carried out entirely by local farmers using manual methods. To separate a block of clay, a trench approximately 50 centimeters deep is first dug at the base of the pit face, while longitudinal cuts are made along both sides to define the section to be removed. The clay block typically measures around 2.5 meters in length, but when required, it may extend up to 6 meters. At a distance of roughly 1 meter from the pit face, a trench is then excavated to knee depth. Sharpened wooden stakes, shaped as wedges, are driven into the trench at intervals of approximately 50 centimeters. Through the combined effect of wedge pressure and water infiltration, fractures develop at the base of the clay, gradually releasing the block from the pit face. Under normal conditions, the clay block separates on its own overnight. Only when time is pressing is a levering beam used to force it free. Any clay not immediately required is left to weather through the winter. Exposed to frost action, the material becomes loosened and workable, ideally suited for house construction and for infilling timber frame walls in the spring. Within the Rhineland cultural sphere, particularly in agricultural regions such as Hunsrück, timber frame construction, known as Fachwerk, was the prevailing architectural form, alongside a parallel tradition of brick and stone building. In 1871, the first stone church in the village of Waschhausen was erected, giving rise to the on-site firing of field bricks, also known as Feldsiegel, directly in the fields. On the eve of the First World War, the first fully brick-built houses appeared, closely tied to a seasonal craft of handmade brick production. After the spring sowing was completed, work at the brickyard began with the preparation of straw mats used to cover and cure the green bricks. These mats protected the unfired bricks from rain and dew, while regulating the rate at which their surfaces dried. The covers were woven from sun-dried cereal straw. The stalks were laid straight and parallel on wooden boards, with the cut ends aligned to form an even surface. Bundles of straw were clamped between wooden battens of equal length, shaping mats approximately 5 meters long. The structure was secured with stakes and bindings, and excess straw was trimmed away. In total, around 40 mats were required. When joined together, they formed a continuous cover nearly 200 meters in length, sufficient to shelter the entire drying area of the brick yard. Clay extraction took place in the Liontal Valley, an area that had previously supplied material for timber frame construction. Near the pit face, a water basin was dug to collect winter water, used for processing the clay. The brick yard was set out on the already worked out part of the pit, starting at the section farthest from the face where straw drying mats had been laid as a base. The yard measured about 10 meters in width and 46 meters in length, aligned on a north-south axis so that westerly winds could pass across it and dry the green bricks evenly. Clay was taken from the pit face, loosened and piled near the yard. Before molding, it was moistened and worked with long-handled narrow hose until the required plasticity was reached, then brought to the molding table for brick forming. Brick molding was carried out on a molding table mounted on wooden wheels, allowing it to be moved easily across the yard. As work progressed, the table was gradually drawn closer to the clay kneading area, facilitating both the supply of clay and the transfer of green bricks to the drying ground. Two molders stood on either side of the table, working with a double wooden mold that had been moistened beforehand. The clay was pressed firmly into the mold and struck off level to form the green brick. Because bricks shrink during firing, the mold was made larger than the dimensions of the finished brick. Once the mold was lifted, the green bricks were placed directly on the drying yard. Labor on the site was clearly divided among clay kneaders, molders, and yard workers. The ground was raked smooth and dusted with fine sand to prevent sticking, ensuring that the bricks retained their shape and that production could proceed without interruption. Once the green bricks had set to a leather-hard state, the yard workers began clearing them from the molding ground. On average, around 2,400 bricks were produced per day. After several days, the entire yard was filled and the cycle of production continued. The bricks were sorted according to their degree of dryness. Freshly molded, still wet bricks were known as green bricks. When the surface had set and the bricks were firm enough to be handled, they were referred to as white bricks and were ready for stacking. The white bricks were stacked upright in Hagen rows along the edge of the yard. This arrangement allowed wind and sunlight to circulate freely, promoting further drying while freeing the molding ground to receive new bricks. After being arranged in Hagen rows, the green bricks continued to dry under controlled conditions. The Hagen stacks were set up parallel to the yard, oriented along a north-south axis, usually consisting of two upright layers of bricks, leaving narrow gaps that allowed wind and air to circulate. Brick curing formed part of a carefully balanced system. Straw mats were used as cover to protect the bricks from rain and to slow excessive drying, which could cause surface cracking. Fine sand was spread on the ground to prevent moisture from rising from the soil. In this way, the bricks dried gradually and evenly before being loaded into the kiln. Brick quality depended directly on the quality of the clay and the manner of its preparation. Roots, gravel, and stones had to be removed to prevent voids or cracks during firing. Moisture content was regulated during kneading so that the clay remained plastic enough to be molded, yet not overly soft. Through the orderly layout of the yard, the careful stacking in Hagen rows, and appropriate covering, the green bricks were kept stable throughout the drying period, ready for the subsequent stages of kiln stacking and firing. Once the bricks had been cleared from the yard, the passageways were cleaned so that the molding table could cycle again from one end of the yard to the other. Impurities such as roots and stones were removed to prevent any disruption to the production process. To accommodate the full seasonal output of green bricks, new Hagen rows were erected parallel to the yard. Their positions were set out by measuring and marking with a line, while two bricks placed on the ground served as guides for the two-layer structure. The base of each hoggen row was raised with earth taken from rain drainage ditches to protect against ground moisture. Gaps equal to the length of a brick were left between the rows to ensure air circulation. The green bricks were stacked upright, slightly inclined, with the direction of the lean alternated in each layer, creating drying gaps while maintaining stability. The feet of the hoggen stacks were reinforced with a course of bricks laid flat, and the ends were tied with crossbonds to bear the load. As the stacks rose higher, bricks laid horizontally formed bridges between the two layers, increasing rigidity and preventing collapse during the drying process. Once the green bricks had dried completely, a field kiln was erected directly on the yard, between the hoggen rows. This was a temporary structure without permanent masonry. The kiln body, fire channels, and air passages were formed entirely from the unfired bricks themselves and the fuel to be burned. The kiln was laid out on a ground plan of roughly 6x 6 meters, sufficient to accommodate the entire seasonal output. Its structure consisted of several parallel firing rows, aligned with the prevailing west-east wind direction. At ground level, air supply flues were left open to feed the firing process and were covered with kiln grates. On either side of these air flues, green bricks were stacked upright to form longitudinal fire channels within each row. The firing rows were built consecutively and shared common partition walls, creating a continuous kiln mass with the overall form of a truncated pyramid. Once construction was complete, the kiln stood ready for fuel loading and the preparation of the firing process. The fuel used for firing was lean coal, a low-smoke coal that burned steadily and was well suited to field brick kilns. Inside the kiln, lump coal was charged only into the fire channels, while coal fines were scattered in greater quantity between the brick courses to regulate and distribute heat. All firing rows followed the same basic structure, but differed in their ignition points. The first row had a closed firing section, whereas the rows behind it were provided with open fire holes for lighting. At the junctions between rows, bricks were laid in cross-bond to enhance stability as the kiln expanded under heat. The green bricks were transported and stacked in the kiln layer by layer. At ground level, the air flues were formed with a width equal to that of a single brick to ensure proper airflow. Most of the internal courses were laid flat. Along the outer edges of the kiln, a vertical course was inserted every few layers to tie the walls and reinforce the structure. Coal fines were spread in thin layers between the brick courses and concentrated in zones exposed to higher temperatures. Where space did not allow full bricks, fragments were packed in to seal the structure. Critical sections of the kiln were set by skilled hands, as even small inaccuracies could lead to cracking or collapse during firing. Once the kiln body had reached its maximum height, work began on completing the upper section. Bricks and fuel were now transported by building the firing rows in stepped stages. creating safe access without the need for scaffolding. In this way, the kiln could be raised to around 30 brick courses, reaching a height of more than 4 meters. As the first rows reached the top, the kiln's crown began to take shape as a narrow band above the main body. A final protective layer of coal was spread over the top to shield the bricks from dew and rain before firing. Throughout this phase, the kiln body was deliberately tapered. The front face was set back by roughly 3 brick lengths to prevent cracking when the entire structure settled by about 30 centimeters after the fuel had burned away. In terms of efficiency, the larger the field kiln, the lower the proportion of underfired bricks at the outer margins. In the final stage, the remaining number of bricks was counted to determine how the closing row would be built. When coal fines were insufficient, lump coal was crushed to make up the difference. Fuel was distributed according to experience, averaging about 80 buckets per firing row from base to crown, with heavier charges at the lower and upper levels than in the middle. The airflow system was designed to match the kiln's scale. In this case, the kiln contained 5 closed firing sections and 5 open coal channels, forming 10 parallel airflows. The final fire channel was widened to the width of a single brick to accommodate the remaining bricks. The last row was built up to the crown and formed the rear longitudinal wall. This wall was inclined less than the front to increase working space, while still preserving the kiln's truncated pyramidal form. The slope was achieved by controlled tilting of the bricks, with the angle increasing gradually from course to course. At the very top, green bricks that had not fully dried were placed as a final layer and enclosed by a locking course. Surplus bricks were added at the rear. Spilled coal was collected, carried up to the crown, and redistributed to improve firing efficiency. The final step was to seal the entire kiln with an airtight skin. Clay was kneaded into a plastic mortar and smeared over the outer faces to close all gaps, protect against rain, and regulate airflow within the kiln. In field kiln technology, airtightness and control of combustion were more critical than outward appearance. After the kiln had been sealed with an airtight clay skin, the firing process began. The clay coating was applied roughly to the kiln faces to close all gaps, its purpose being the control of airflow rather than visual finish. Ignition was directed by the master burner. The guiding principle was that the fire must spread slowly, starting at the center and then advancing upward and outward to both sides, in keeping with the kiln's gradual settling during firing. The first fire was lit in the open coal channel at the center of the kiln. The adjacent channels were then ignited one by one, progressing from the inside toward the outer rows. Before entering the main high-temperature firing phase, the kiln passed through a period of low, smoldering fire. This preheating stage warmed the entire kiln mass and drove out residual moisture from the bricks. The outermost fire channels were ignited last to prevent a rapid rise in temperature. Each firing opening was sealed with clay immediately after lighting. Once the fire had stabilized, the kiln was completely closed, leaving only the crown open as a flue for smoke. From this point, the field kiln burned continuously for 3 to 4 weeks, until the entire load of bricks was thoroughly fired. During firing, the spread of the flame had to be monitored continuously. The master burner intervened whenever signs of thermal imbalance appeared, particularly under strong wind conditions, which could deflect the fire and cause cracking in the kiln body. To reduce the influence of wind, straw windbreaks were hung from pole frames on the windward side, set at a safe distance from the kiln. As wind direction shifted, these screens were repositioned accordingly to stabilize the airflow entering the kiln. A clear indication that the fire was advancing in the correct sequence was the appearance of cone-shaped darkening on the kiln walls. The degree of firing was further assessed through the radiant heat emitted by the hardened clay shell. If cracks opened in the firing zones, infiltrating air could trigger uncontrolled combustion. Such fissures had to be sealed immediately with clay, and the kiln walls reinforced to prevent progressive collapse. When higher temperatures were required, the fire channels were opened to intensify combustion from the base, raising the temperature to around 1,200 degrees. At this stage, the kiln crown and other hot spots were covered with additional clay to retain heat and prevent the fire from flaring out of control. After the firing cycle ended in late autumn, the kiln was left to cool completely for 3 to 4 weeks before being dismantled. As it cooled, the clay shell flaked away and the dark burn marks gradually disappeared. Complete cooling was essential, both for safety and for assessing the quality of the bricks. The master burner tested the results by removing bricks from the inner courses. Bricks of good quality showed a reddish-brown color and produced a clear ringing sound when struck together, indicating that they were fully fired. A familiar sign of a successful firing was the kiln crown settling into a shallow, bowl-like depression. Dismantling began with the removal of the clay shell, after which the kiln was taken down in stepped stages, row by row, mirroring the method of its construction. Once a row had been cleared down to ground level, the area was cleaned so that carts could move in to collect the bricks. The bricks were sorted during dismantling according to their position within the kiln. Those from the base, along the walls, and beneath the crown were often underfired and known as white bricks. Used for internal partitions, they accounted for roughly 1/5 of the output. The best bricks came from the middle zones, dark red in color and highly weather-resistant. These were known as clunker and were used for exterior walls. Bricks that had been overfired near the hottest fire channels fused together and were typically reused for hydraulic works or paving. Firing waste was reused as well. Ash served as sand for the brick yard, while broken bricks were spread on village roads. Dismantling and transport followed a system of communal labor, with brick carts moving back and forth throughout the winter, preparing for the building season in spring. In the Einhaus farmhouses of Hunsrück, the threshing floor, or tenne, was the central space connecting the living area, the granary, and the stables. It functioned as a carriage passage and threshing area, and carried the greatest load within the building. For this reason, the floor was made of Lehmstrich, a rammed clay surface with high strength and load-bearing capacity. Its construction reflects a traditional building technique closely tied to agricultural life in Hunsrück. In the households of craftsmen and day laborers, agriculture was of secondary importance. The threshing floor was therefore no longer the center of the house. Granaries were small and separated from the living space. Threshing took place in front of the house on a separate outdoor surface. In earlier times, when grain was threshed by hand with flails, the surface quickly subsided under cart traffic and repeated impact. For this reason, the rammed clay floor had to be renewed regularly, on average every 3 years. The renewal of the threshing floor surface began with the selective removal of the old clay screed. Having been compacted over many years, the layer had to be broken up with a pickaxe. The clay came away in large slabs while retaining a certain elasticity. Removal was limited to roughly 2/3 of the front area, where cart traffic and threshing took place, to a depth of 15 to 20 centimeters as defined by the brick-built threshold. The excavated clay was loaded onto a modified horse-drawn cart and tipped off using a lever bar, an indispensable tool in manual transport. After the old material had been removed from the yard, the next step was to extract fresh clay from the village's communal clay pit, usually located at the edge of the cultivated land. The clay was dug in autumn, left to weather through the winter, and allowed to dry naturally in spring. Through this process, it reached a condition that was both friable and plastic, suitable for mixing and ramming into a new threshing floor surface. After transport to the farm, the clay was temporarily stored in the granary. Because the space was shallow and the cart heavily loaded, a draft animal was harnessed to the rear axle to help reverse the cart into position. Once the cart was correctly aligned, the 2 front boards were removed. The rear boards were then lifted with a lever bar and temporarily hung on a post to open the cart bed. The clay was pushed down onto the threshing floor in large blocks. Depending on the size of the farm, this operation required 1 or several cartloads. Once the clay had been stockpiled, work began on spreading and shaping the new floor layer. The raw clay was heaped in the center of the yard, and first had to be carefully cleared of all impurities such as stones, roots, and debris. The clay was then spread evenly and roughly leveled over the area where the old floor had been removed. Smaller lumps were placed tightly together, with the surface built up about 1 to 2 feet above the final level to allow for settlement during ramming. At the same time, a slight gradient was formed toward the threshold to ensure rainwater runoff from the floor surface. After the clay had been spread and roughly shaped, water was sprinkled slowly with cans and distributed evenly across the entire surface. The amount was carefully regulated. When the clay began to adhere lightly to the soles of the shoes, the moisture content was considered suitable for mixing. The mixing itself was carried out by oxen, whose hooves trampled and worked the clay. The animals were led in circular paths, from the outer edge toward the center, ensuring an even blend. Throughout this stage, cleanliness was strictly maintained to prevent organic contamination that could weaken the finished floor. After sufficient treading, the clay became plastic, smooth, and homogeneous. According to traditional experience, the thoroughness of this mixing directly determined the durability and load-bearing capacity of the threshing floor surface. After the clay had been thoroughly mixed, the next step was to compact the surface using the Schleppen-Gehen method. This was a form of manual compression by foot, carried out with the participation of children under adult supervision. The children were instructed to tread evenly across the entire yard, using the full sole of the foot and applying body weight with each step. At first, they walked in winding rows to cover the surface completely. They then moved in straight lines, back and forth, to compact the still plastic clay evenly. This process sealed the surface and increased the cohesion of the clay, preparing it for the subsequent finishing stages. Children who took part were often encouraged with small rewards, reflecting the spirit of communal labor embedded in traditional rural life. Once the ramming work was finished, labor gave way to a more communal atmosphere. A temporary swing was hung from a roof beam in the granary, becoming a place of play and marking the close of the working day. This activity was known as Schleppengehen, both a labor process and a form of communal festivity. According to local memory, children between the ages of 7 and 14 took part in Schleppengehen during the middle of the haymaking season and the beginning of the harvest, rotating among farms within the village. The working day ended with collective games, allowing the children to cross the yard one final time, both for enjoyment and to complete the even compaction of the floor. When the treading phase was complete, the floor surface was further compacted and leveled by hand. The worker used a tenenpleche, a heavy beechwood pounding board with a curved handle. Its face was kept wet at all times to prevent the clay from sticking and to allow smooth, even movement. With steady lifting and striking motions, the board erased footprints and compressed the clay layer beneath even further. During this process, any remaining foreign matter, down to the smallest scraps of paper, had to be removed immediately, as such inclusions could weaken the screed once it dried. Deeper depressions were filled with moist clay and beaten again until the surface was level and the clay layers bonded into a single, coherent mass, ready for the final stage of finishing. The finishing work began at the rear of the yard and progressed gradually toward the front, divided into transverse strips. Each strip was continued only after the previous one had been completed, and the finished surface was never stepped on. The final layer was smoothed with a clembrette, a flat wooden board made of soft, low-resin wood and kept wet during use. Once completed, the floor finished level and tightly sealed at the threshold. In some regions, cattle blood was sprinkled onto the surface, a symbolic practice rooted in older tradition. Finally, the granary doors were kept closed for about 2 weeks to protect the floor from strong sunlight and prevent cracking. When the surface had fully dried, the threshing floor was ready for use, prepared for the next harvest season, as it had been for generations. From the extraction of clay with wooden wedges, through field firing of bricks, to the making of the threshing floor surface, this account records a sequence of traditional building techniques closely bound to agricultural life in Hunsrück and the wider Rhineland. Clay appears not merely as a common building material, but as a resource managed systematically through the seasons. Winter weathering, controlled drying, kiln stacking, and experience-based firing reveal a close interplay between natural conditions, craft knowledge, and communal organization of labor. Across these stages, building work emerges as an integral part of village life. From the master craftsman to the children treading the floor, each role contributed to the preservation of techniques that shaped living spaces and agricultural production over many generations. Thank you for staying with us until the end of this story. If you enjoy videos like this, please like, share, and subscribe to the channel so you don't miss the next stories to come. Raw Machines thanks you, and until next time.